Well, welcome everybody. My name is Claude Steele. I'm the Dean of the Stanford Graduate School of Education. And I also count myself a good friend of Bill and Mary Ellen Bowen's. And so it is a real special pleasure to introduce Bill's second lecture, second Tanner lecture in 2 days, entitled Prospects for an Online Fix. Can we harness technology in the service of our aspirations? Long ago, when I started my own career as a social scientist, I thought one of the prime purposes of that enterprise was to bring careful, reasoned, and empirical investigation to important issues, even if they were controversial issues. And I guess I also thought that if one did that, one would more or less naturally have the courage to speak up publicly about one's work, to offer it for the public good, even if that meant facing public opposition. I assumed that this is what social science in some significant part was about, developing reasoned, empirically tested, well-discussed understandings from which society and the public good could be improved. But I know now that this ideal is more easily aspired to than it is lived up to, that taking on big important questions is awfully hard to do, and that having good evidence or reasoned arguments is not the same as having the courage to offer it up for the public good, again, especially in controversial areas. Doing that, affirming that mission of social science and academic leadership, seems to take an extra degree of courage or personal integrity. It's a courage, I believe, that has to be fostered and sustained in a community of scholars and scientists. There have to be role models. There has to be even inspiration. There are many things to admire about Bill Bowen. As John Hennessy mentioned yesterday, his prodigious energy and work ethic, it's breathtaking. 6 major books in the last decade, for example, each of those books having a major impact on how we think about higher education, how we do it, how we face some of the toughest issues in the area. There's also the accomplishments of his plain insight and leadership in higher education. These two are breathtaking. His efficiency, his effectiveness, he gets more done by noon than the rest of us do in a week. But the thing I admire most about him is his embodiment of this old school value, his courage to bring evidence to bear on the major and important hot button issues of our times, not just once or twice, but consistently, over and over again for the last 4.5 decades. He has given us a great instruction through his written work and his own behavior in how to handle these issues and how to make progress in higher education against really tough challenges. Just look at the list of topics that he has turned his empirical focus on. I won't go into a lot of detail. John reviewed these well last night, but just the power of them is impressive. Affirmative action, doing what still stands as perhaps the most important empirical study ever done in this area. The very challenging problems associated with college sports programs at all levels of education, the implications for all levels of education, the reasons behind the increasing costs of higher education, as was his focus in yesterday's talk, the role of identity, especially social class, race, ethnicity, in gaining access to higher education and in academic performance, as well as books on just the best practices in faculty governance and university governance and management. Should it be any surprise then that returning to the topic of his Oxford lectures in the year 2000, he should again find himself at the very center of today's hottest issue in higher education, perhaps of all of education, online and blended learning. Yesterday, he described the cost disease phenomenon in higher education. This disease is rooted in education's being a labor-intensive enterprise that, for the most part, doesn't benefit from steadily improving efficiencies like other industries. We don't have efficiencies that enable us to produce more, that is to, for example, matriculate more students with less labor and lower costs. So our costs go up slightly faster than costs in other sectors of the economy, and this results in what he's called a cost disease. Unless, of course, technology in the form of online and blended learning can come to the rescue. These are challenging times. We have a less productive national economy than we used to. There is great resistance to taxation for anything, including education, research, and development. There are more students to educate from more diverse backgrounds, and our international competition is greatly intensifying. We indeed need help, major help. Will these forms of technology be that help? There is no one whose broad, deep, and long experience in higher education gives them a better purview from which to answer this question. I'm dying to hear what he thinks, both what he thinks about the potential of these technologies to reduce costs, but also what he thinks about their impact on what we conceptualize higher education to be. This will be an important and an interesting talk and an important and interesting discussion to follow. I give you Bill Bowen.
That was very generous, thank you. Now I'm going to try once again to produce a slide at one point. Claude, thank you very much. I should say, first of all, that I've been asked sometimes about taking on controversial topics, and I'm reminded that my wife says the explanation for this proclivity is that I'm trained to deal with hostility. Trained by whom? Well, we won't go into that. I have been asked by a number of people about access, particularly to the over 100 endnotes that accompany the written form of these talks. And I should report to you that the two talks with their over 100 endnotes will be posted as of tonight on the ITHAKA website. It's ITHAKA with a K, ITHAKA.org, and that's where they will be posted. The hope eventually is that they will be published with commentaries by the Princeton Press. Now, and I should also say that in order to spare you and all of us, I have cut pieces out of these talks, and the talks in their entirety are on, or will be as of tonight, on the website. Now, in this second lecture, I will, as Claude said, discuss the prospects for using new technologies to address the productivity, cost, affordability issues that I tabled yesterday. I regard the prospects as promising, but also challenging. My focus will be on the contributions to be expected from established universities already serving large numbers of students. To be sure, we also want to serve new populations at home and abroad, and a worldwide diffusion of knowledge is a most worthy goal, but it is not my central topic tonight. Finally, in the search for new approaches, we need to recognize how well we already do some things, and how important it is that our educational institutions continue to stand for core values. This is the note on which I will end today. I am not a futurist, but rather a maddeningly practical person who rarely has visions, and when I do, they are usually the result of having had a bad meal. But let me put such predilections to one side and ask you to join me in imagining, just for a moment, how the intelligent harnessing of information technology might alter aspects of university life as we know it. Can we imagine a university at some point in the future in which faculty collaborations focus more on teaching, with technology serving as the forcing function, in which faculty devote more of their time to promoting the active learning of their students and are actually freed from much of the tedium of grading, in which students receive more and more timely, individualized feedback on assignments, in which technology is used to bring the perspectives of a more diverse student body to the campus because of its capacity to engage students from all over the world, in which technology extends the educational process throughout one's life through the educational equivalents of booster shots. And finally, a university in which institutional costs and tuition charges rise at a slower rate than we've been used to. Now, before considering how such nirvana might at least be approached, I want to describe ever so briefly the evolution of my own thinking about technology and online learning, which dates back, as Claude suggested, at least as far as the Romanes lecture I gave at Oxford in 2000. In that lecture, I stressed the need to be realistic in thinking about how technology impacts costs, and I cited an early study at the University of Illinois that concluded sound online instruction is likely to cost more than traditional instruction. I then cited a supporting observation from another study. My conclusion at the time, all the talk of using technology to save money by increasing productivity has a hollow ring. I next added the not so profound thought that this could change. I am today a convert. I have come to believe that now is the time, that far greater access to the internet, improvements in internet speed, reductions in storage costs, and other advances have combined to suggest, along with changing mindsets, that online learning in many of its manifestations can lead to good learning outcomes at lower cost. The throwaway phrase in many of its manifestations is important. Much confusion can result from failing to recognize that online learning is far from one thing and far from static. My colleague Kelly Lack, who's with us here today, and I tried diligently to produce a kind of topography that we thought would be helpful, and we failed. It was just too hard and too complicated, and so we did create a kind of typology, but we consigned it to an appendix to the online version of what I'm going to say. It will not be imposed upon you. A far more sophisticated observer of digital trends than I am, President Hennessy, has been quoted as saying, "There's a tsunami coming, but I can't tell you exactly how it's going to break." Since I live on the East Coast, not on the West Coast, I'm even less capable of judging tsunamis, their shape, their force, or their timing. But I too am convinced that online learning could be truly transformative. What needs to be done to translate could into will? The principal barriers to overcome can be grouped under three headings. The appalling lack of hard evidence about both learning outcomes and cost savings. That's first. The need for shared but customizable teaching and learning platforms or toolkits. That's second. And then the need for both new mindsets and fresh thinking about models of decision making. I'm going to talk about each of these three. The lack of hard evidence. Prominent leaders in higher education have made it abundantly clear that faculty and leadership of many institutions will consider transformative changes in how they teach if and only if they have more hard evidence about potential gains. To be sure, better facts will not suffice to bring about change, but evidence may well be a necessary, if not a sufficient condition. How effective has online learning been in improving or at least maintaining learning outcomes achieved by various populations of students? Unfortunately, no one really knows the answer to either that question or the obvious follow-on query about cost savings. There have been literally thousands of studies of online learning, and Kelly and I have attempted to catalog them and summarize their import in a paper cited in the online version of this talk. This has been a daunting and, we have to say, discouraging task. Very few of these studies are relevant to the teaching of undergraduates. The few that are relevant almost always suffer from serious methodological deficiencies, the most common being small sample size, inability to control for ubiquitous selection effects, and on the cost side, the lack of good estimates of likely cost savings in steady state. Kelly and I thought originally the full responsibility for this sad state of affairs rests with those who conducted the studies. We have revised that judgment. A significant share of responsibility rests with those who have created and used the online pedagogies, since the content often does not lend itself to rigorous assessment, and offerings are rarely designed with evaluation in mind. Also at play is what I can only call the missionary spirit. The creators of many online approaches are true believers who simply want to get on with their work without being distracted by the need to do careful assessments. In an effort to fill part of this gaping knowledge gap, the ITHAKA organization, headed by Kevin Guthrie, here with us today, mounted an empirical study of the learning outcomes associated with the use of a prototype statistics course developed by Carnegie Mellon, taught in a hybrid mode with one face-to-face session a week. The Carnegie Mellon course has several appealing features, including its use of cognitive tutors and feedback loops to guide students through instruction in basic statistical concepts. In our study, we used a randomized trials approach to compare the learning outcomes of students who took a hybrid version of this highly interactive course with the learning outcomes of students who took face-to-face counterpart courses. We collected mountains of data on campuses at the State University of New York, the City University of New York, and the University System of Maryland. Although this study had limitations of its own, which we describe in it, we believe it is the most rigorous assessment to date of the use of a sophisticated online course by the kinds of public universities that most desperately need to counteract the cost disease. I will cite only two findings from this study. First, we found no statistically significant differences in standard measures of learning outcomes, pass completion rates, grades, results of a test, national test of statistical literacy between students in the traditional classes and students in the hybrid online format classes. Now, my effort to show you one figure. You see that the results of these learning outcomes are very similar. This finding in and of itself is not different from the results of many earlier studies. Aha, I got rid of it. Oop, no, back, gone. But it is important to emphasize that the relevant effect coefficients in this study have very small standard errors. One commentator, Mike McPherson, president of the Spencer Foundation, observed that what we have here are quite precisely estimated zeros. That is, if there had been pronounced differences in outcomes between traditional format and hybrid format groups, we would almost certainly have found them. Now, second, this finding is relentlessly consistent across not only campuses, but across subgroups of what was a very diverse student population. Half the students in our study came from families with incomes less than $50,000. Half were first-generation college goers. Fewer than half were white, and the group was about evenly divided between students with college GPAs above and below 3.0. The finding of consistent outcomes across this varied population rebuts the proposition that only exceptionally well-prepared, high-achieving students can succeed in online settings. Thus, while we did not find transformational improvements in learning outcomes, we did obtain compelling evidence that students with a wide range of characteristics learn just as much in the hybrid online format as they would have had they instead taken the course in the traditional format, and they spent less time. Students at the four-year institutions in our study paid no price in terms of pass rates or other learning outcomes for taking a hybrid course. This seemingly bland result is in fact very important in light of perhaps the most common reason given by faculty for resisting the use of online instruction. They often say, we worry that basic student learning outcomes will be hurt and we won't expose our students to this risk. The ITHAKA research suggests that such worries may not be well-founded, at least in situations akin to those we studied. But what about cost savings? Whether the pedagogies such as the ones we tested can in fact raise productivity by reducing instructional costs, the denominator, thereby helping address the cost problem, is an absolutely central question. Because of its clear importance, we thought hard about how to estimate potential cost savings. Truth be told, we did not do nearly as well in looking at the cost blade of the scissors as we did in looking at learning outcomes. We were able to do no more than suggest a method of approach and hazard what are little more than rough guesses, speculations as to the conceivable magnitude of potential savings in staffing costs. The fundamental problem, cutting across all types of online offerings, is that contemporaneous comparisons of the costs of traditional modes of teaching and online pedagogies are near useless in projecting steady-state savings, or, worse yet, highly misleading. The reason is that the costs of doing almost anything for the first time are very different from the cost of doing the same thing numerous times. That admonition holds in spades in the case of online learning. To avoid this problem, we carried out simulated cost probes, which were very rough at best and ignored all sorts of important things like joint products and so forth. We found that there were conceivable guesstimates of cost savings ranging from 36 to 57% when traditional teaching mode relied on multiple sections, and this simulation underestimates dramatically what are really potential savings when you take into account all sorts of things that we didn't think about at all, including scheduling flexibility. The ITHAKA study is helpful in overcoming skepticism, but it involved only one course in a field well suited to online learning in predominantly on-site contexts. We need many more careful studies of varied approaches carried out in a variety of settings, including two-year colleges. Nor is it sufficient simply to compare outcomes of particular online offerings with outcomes in traditional face-to-face courses. We also need studies that compare the effectiveness of different approaches to online learning. Our intuition told us that the highly interactive Carnegie Mellon course was promising, which is why we elected to test it. But this course was expensive to develop and took a long time. Its value needs to be compared with the value of other approaches that are cheaper and less complex. It would also be highly desirable to compare outcomes and costs associated with various MOOCs against other approaches to online learning. And we have to recognize that such comparisons will, I'm sure, vary with student populations and campus settings. The ITHAKA organization, working with Coursera and others, is contemplating just such a cross-platform study in collaboration with the University System of Maryland. If we can bring this off, it could be actually very important. Designing research strategies in this area is a complicated business under the best of circumstances. Randomized trials are, it is generally agreed, the most promising way of reducing the ever-present risk of selection bias. But a huge, huge takeaway from our empirical research using this methodology is that it is expensive and devilishly difficult to carry out on actual campuses. I won't bore you with a recitation of the problems. They are spelled out in an appendix to the report. Looking ahead, I now think, heresy of heresies, that the case for using randomized trials should itself be subject to careful cost-benefit analysis. Appealing as the randomized approach is, this may be an instance in which, at least in some situations, the best is the enemy of the good. Last on my short list of research priorities is the evident need for creative analyses on the cost side of the ledger. This work should do more than just project direct costs. It should include implications for spatialization, capital costs, indirect costs, and it should also consider freshly the many ways in which online technologies may influence the way sizable parts of the curriculum can be re-engineered, bearing in mind the example I gave you yesterday of the introduction of electricity in manufacturing. The biggest opportunity for MOOCs to raise productivity system-wide and lower costs may well lie in finding effective ways for third parties to certify the creditworthiness of their courses, the success of students in passing them, and in time reduce time to degree. So that's need one, better evidence. Need two, the need for a customizable, sustainable platform or toolkit. A major conclusion of another ITHAKA study, Barriers to Adoption of Online Learning, is that perhaps, and now I quote, the largest obstacle to widespread adoption of such sophisticated approaches is the lack at the present time of a sustainable platform that allows interested faculty either to create a fully interactive machine-guided learning environment or to customize a course that has been created by someone else and thus claim it as their own. A companion conclusion is that faculty are extremely reluctant to teach courses that they do not own. As one commentator put it, no one wants to give someone else's speech, even though all of us are happy to borrow felicitous phrases. This is by no means just about ego, though ego is certainly involved. Faculty may understandably feel that they are not sufficiently familiar with content prepared by others to use it, and of course the structure of content and examples often need to vary by situation. It would be easy, but incorrect, to infer from this line of argument that development of online courses has to be a responsibility of each individual campus. Reliance on purely homegrown approaches would be foolishly inefficient and simply will not work in most settings. It will not take advantage of economies of scale, including effective methods of peer-to-peer interaction. Furthermore, many institutions simply do not have the resources, either financial or technical, to proceed along this path. Nor would it make sense to reinvent wheels that can be readily shared. There is clearly a system-wide need for a sophisticated, customizable platform or toolkit that can be made widely available, maintained, upgraded, and sustained in a cost-effective manner. Yet higher education thus far has failed to find a convincing solution to this problem. Immediate prospects for a solution are uncertain at best. In seeking to address this need, we have to recognize the high probability that quite different pedagogies will be appropriate in subjects in which there are concrete concepts to be mastered, one right answer, basic statistics, as contrasted with discursive subjects which benefit from the exchange of different points of view, the Arab-Israeli conflict. A strong prima facie case can be made for a high-level collaborative effort within the traditional higher education community. After all, collaborations have been highly beneficial in sharing other assets, such as ultra-expensive scientific equipment. It is, however, widely recognized that collaborative efforts are difficult to organize, especially when much nimbleness is needed. Collective decision-making is often cumbersome, and it can be hard to avoid lowest common denominator thinking. My favorite example is the Peace of Paris negotiations at the end of World War I, which ended so disastrously. Keynes' famous account of the collective efforts of the participants is worth quoting. Quote, "These then were the personalities of Paris. I forbear to mention other nations or lesser men. Clemenceau, aesthetically the noblest, the President, morally the most admirable, Lloyd George, intellectually the subtlest. Out of their disparities and weaknesses, the treaty was born, child of the least worthy attribute of each of its parents, without nobility, without morality, without intellect." There is then much to be said for seeking leadership from single entities that are respected and that have a demonstrated capacity to execute. We could, of course, simply let the marketplace decide and provide, and it's possible that for-profit entities trading on financial incentives might develop one or more effective platforms. There is, however, a risk that a for-profit might elect to cover some or all of its costs by essentially privatizing the significant amount of information that such online systems generate about how students learn. The example of Google illustrates dramatically the value that can be derived from exploiting a proprietary database for purposes such as selling targeted advertising. Massive amounts of data on how students learn can further the core mission of not-for-profit higher education and lead in time to the creation of better adaptive learning systems. It would be unfortunate if the potential public good benefits of the rich information generated by online learning systems were lost. The educational community writ large should think hard about whether and how a nonprofit repository for such information could be created and then maintained. In my view, the most promising, though still entirely speculative, option for creating the kind of platform or toolkit I'm talking about is the possibility that leading MOOCs might meet the need for readily adaptable platforms or toolkits. Coursera, edX, Class2Go have said that they are committed to developing systems that can be used widely by others, and so has Carnegie Mellon. No one should doubt the good intentions of such entities, nor should anyone undervalue the substantial resources at their disposal. Indeed, it is precisely because these entities have a rare combination of assets, impressive technical capacity, a strong financial base, and real standing in the academic community, enhanced by extraordinary media coverage, that I regard them right now as the highest potential game in town. But neither should anyone underestimate the difficulty of modifying MOOCs originally designed to provide direct instruction to many thousands of individual students worldwide so that they can also serve the needs of existing educational institutions serving defined student populations. The interviews we did for the barrier study revealed little enthusiasm for prepackaged online courses that did not permit customization, regardless of the standing of the institution sponsoring the course, the quality of the course, or the standing of the faculty creating the course. And there is something of an inherent conflict, or at least a tension, between, on the one hand, the structure of MOOC offerings designed largely by renowned high-visibility professors at leading universities which are generally provided worldwide on an as-is basis, and on the other hand, the need for at least some campus customization. A related point is that the cost-effectiveness of MOOCs in their direct-to-student mode stems largely from the fact that their one-size-fits-all structure drives the marginal cost of serving even an extra 1,000 students close to zero. It is much less obvious how or even whether large cost savings can be achieved when a MOOC has to be customized for local use by a particular institution with a defined population. In addition, there are legions of IP issues. We should also recognize that while there has been much discussion about potential sources of revenue for MOOCs, charging for certificates of completion, becoming a kind of job placement enterprise, and so on, the viability of the various hypothetical possibilities remains to be demonstrated. A major lesson from the earlier MIT experience with OpenCourseware, OCW, is that it can be much easier to create something like OCW, often with philanthropic support, than to find regular sources of revenue to pay the ongoing costs of maintaining and upgrading the enterprise. MIT today is still paying the running costs of OCW each year. And we are told that the faculty and trustees of MIT are convinced that they cannot go down the same path again, their pride in OCW notwithstanding. Donor fatigue is a fact of life, and some regular, predictable source of revenue is needed for sustainability. There is real danger in announcing that something is free without knowing who is to pay the ongoing costs, which are real and can't be ignored. The no free lunch adage comes to mind. Now, these cautions and open questions about MOOCs cannot be ignored or assumed away. Nevertheless, I believe that the educational community should make every effort to take advantage of the great strengths of the MOOCs, which I listed a moment ago. Not only should we encourage their continuing interest in serving existing institutions, but we should try to find ways of testing learning outcomes and assessing cost-saving options for specific universities and university systems. Right now, as far as I'm aware, no real evidence exists as to how well MOOCs can produce good learning outcomes for 18 to 22-year-olds of various backgrounds studying on mainline campuses. And this is a huge gap in our knowledge. Moreover, the entire higher education community has an interest in thinking along with the MOOCs about sustainable business models, and I suspect that long run, some kind of system of charging reasonable fees to institutions and perhaps students that benefit from the cost-saving features of these systems will be at least part of the answer. Now I turn to my third and last category of needs to be addressed. It is something of a grab bag, but a hopeful one, useful one, I hope. Many of the specific issues listed in the Barriers to Adoption report share the attribute of requiring strong institutional leadership and even fresh ways of thinking about decision-making. These are not easy questions. Hard as it is for beleaguered deans and presidents to confront challenges of these kinds directly, it is rarely wise to gloss over the most sensitive issues. I am convinced that a new, tougher mindset is a prerequisite to progress. There is too strong a tendency to respond to financial pressures by economizing around the edges and putting off bigger and harder choices in the hope that the sun will shine tomorrow, even if the forecast is for rain. The seemingly unrelenting upward spiral of costs and tuition charges can be arrested, at least in some degree, only if presidents, provosts, trustees make controlling both costs and tuition increases a priority. Academic leaders must look explicitly for strategies to lower costs. I am not saying that educational leaders lack courage, though sadly some do. Controlling costs is a tough sell, in part because strong forces are pushing in the opposite direction. And as one of my friends said, those opposed have so many ways of throwing sand in the wheels. Presidents and provosts should not mince words in charging deans and faculty with teaching courses of comparable or higher quality with fewer resources, thereby lowering the denominator of the productivity ratio. There is a definite political aspect to all of this. We simply have to recognize that if higher education does not begin to slow the rate of increase in college costs, our nation's higher educational system will lose the public support on which it so heavily depends. There has been an undeniable erosion of public trust in the capacity of higher education to operate more efficiently. Efforts to save resources should be highly visible. Those who are skeptical about the capacity of established institutions to take positive steps need to be given evidence that change is possible. One favorable omen is the openness of many faculty to new ways of thinking, including the desirability of flipping the classroom. Still, growing openness to such concepts does not translate automatically into new modes of teaching. Required is a willingness to question established norms, including models of decision-making. The challenges are at least as much organizational and administrative as they are technical. I wonder if the particular modes of what is often called shared governance that have been developed over the last century are well suited to the digital world. Shared governance can mean dividing up tasks in seemingly clear-cut ways, leaving corporate decisions of one kind or another entirely in the hands of trustees, academic decisions entirely in the hands of faculty. But if wise decisions are to be made in key areas such as teaching methods, it is imperative that they be made by a mix of individuals from different parts of the institution, including faculty leaders, but also others well-positioned to consider the full ramifications of the choices before them. There are real dangers in relying on the compartmentalized thinking that too often accompanies the decentralized modes of organization to which we have become accustomed. Specific organizational approaches will appropriately vary from institution to institution, but the general principle is clear. Some centralized calibration of benefits and costs is essential. In a less complex age, it may have been sensible to leave almost all decisions concerning not just what to teach, but how to teach in the hands of individual faculty members. It is by no means clear, however, that this is the right model going forward, and it would be highly desirable if the academic community itself were seized of this issue and addressed it before outsiders dictate their own solutions. Faculty involvement is essential, self-evident need for consultation with those who are expert in their disciplines and experienced in teaching. But this is not the same thing as giving faculty a veto power over change. Nor is this, I would emphasize, an issue of academic freedom, as that critically important concept is properly understood. Faculty members should be entirely free to speak their minds as scholars and as teachers, but this freedom of expression should not imply unilateral control over methods of teaching. There is nothing in the basic documents explaining academic freedom to suggest that such control is included. It isn't. If academic freedom is construed to mean the faculty can do anything they choose or refuse anything they want to refuse, it becomes meaningless and indefensible. I turn now to what must we retain. I circle back to what I said at the start of this talk. As we contemplate a rapidly evolving world in which greater use will surely be made of online modes of teaching, I am convinced that there are central aspects of life on our traditional campuses that must not only be retained, but it must be strengthened. I will mention three. First, the need to re-emphasize the great value of minds rubbing against minds. We should resist efforts to overdo online instruction, important as it can be. Those of us who have benefited from personal interactions with brilliant teachers, some of whom became close friends, as I certainly did, can testify to the inspirational, life-changing aspects of such experiences. Great teachers change the way their students see the world and themselves, long after their students have forgotten much of the content of courses. Moreover, a great advantage of residential institutions is that genuine learning occurs more or less constantly and more often than not, out of the classroom. This cliche, repeated by countless presidents, actually conveys real truth. As one of my greatest teachers, Jacob Viner, never tired of warning his students, there is no limit to the amount of nonsense you can think if you think too long alone. My plea is for the adoption of a portfolio approach to curricular development that provides a carefully calibrated mix of learning styles. Some online learning, much person-to-person interaction, directed study, and all the rest. Some people think that the wealthiest, most privileged institutions can stay pretty much as they are, at least in the short run, and don't have to participate in the evolution of online learning. I think this is mistaken. The students at these places, along with others of their generation, will expect to use digital resources and to be trained in their use. And as the technologies grow increasingly sophisticated and we learn more about how students learn and what pedagogical methods work best in different fields, even top-tier institutions will stand to gain from the use of such technologies to improve student learning. And the second thing I think we must maintain, whatever the provocations, is the unswerving commitment of colleges and universities to freedom of thought. Is exemplified so clearly by my great friend of many years, Richard Lyman, Stanford's 7th president, who died in May of this year. President Lyman stood resolutely for civility and protection of the rights of all. When he was compelled to summon the police to curb an over-the-edge demonstration in 1969, his action was applauded by some, but Dick thought the applause was misplaced. He said, "Anytime it becomes necessary for a university to summon the police, a defeat has taken place. The victory we seek at Stanford is not like a military victory. It is a victory of reason and the examined life over unreason and the tyranny of coercion." So right. Third, in terms of what we must retain, our colleges and universities should focus, I think, unashamedly on values as well as on knowledge. We should spend more time than we usually do considering how best to accomplish this. This is definitely not a plea for pontificating. When Robert Hutchins was urged to teach his students at Chicago to do this, that, or the other thing, he demurred, explaining, and I quote, "All attempts to teach character directly will fail. They degenerate into vague exhortations to be good, which leave the bored listener with a desire to commit outrages which would otherwise never have occurred to him." Let me now refer to a baccalaureate address given at Princeton in 2010 by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, titled, "We Are What We Choose." Bezos began by reciting a poignant story of a trip he took with his grandparents when he was 10 years old. While riding in their Airstream trailer, this precocious 10-year-old, he was always smart, laboriously calculated the damage to her health that his grandmother was doing by smoking. His conclusion was that at 2 minutes per puff, she was taking 9 years off her life. When he proudly told her of his finding, she burst into tears. His grandfather stopped the car and gently said to Jeff, "One day you'll understand that it's harder to be kind than clever." Bezos went on to talk about the difference between gifts and choices. Cleverness, he said, is a gift. Kindness is a choice. Gifts are easy, they're given, after all. Choices can be hard. Colleges and universities can and should find ways to help their students learn this key distinction and encourage them at least some of the time to choose kindness over cleverness. I return finally what one of my friends called the most beautiful word in the English language to the question posed at the outset of this talk. Is online learning a fix for the cost disease? My answer, not by itself, but it can be part of an answer. It is certainly no panacea for this country's deep-seated educational problems, which are rooted in social issues, fiscal dilemmas, national priorities, and in historical practices. In the case of a topic as active as online learning, we should expect inflated claims of spectacular successes and of blatant failures. The findings I have reported warn strongly against too much hype. What Keynes said about those who claim knowledge of the currency question can be applied to online learning. Keynes observed, "Only one man in 1,000 understands the currency question, and I meet him every day." There is a real danger that the media frenzy associated with MOOCs will lead some colleges and universities, perhaps especially business-oriented members of their boards, to embrace too tightly the MOOC approach before it is adequately tested and found to be both sustainable and capable of delivering good learning outcomes to all kinds of students. Uncertainties notwithstanding, it is clear to me that online systems have great potential. Vigorous efforts should be made to explore further uses of both the relatively simple systems that are proliferating all around us, often to good effect, and more sophisticated systems that are still in their infancy and are sure to improve over time, perhaps dramatically. In these explorations, I would urge us not to hesitate to experiment, but always to insist on assessments of outcomes. I would also urge us to think in terms of system-wide approaches and to exercise that rarest of virtues, patience. The careful development and testing of promising new pedagogies can take years and even decades. I will end now with a last story on the theme of patience. It comes from the Arabian Nights, and I owe it to a very wise man, very good friend, Ezra Zilka, who was born in Baghdad. This is the story of the Black Horse. A prisoner who was about to be executed was having his last audience with the Sultan. He implored the Sultan, "If you will spare me for 1 year, I will teach your favorite black horse to talk." The Sultan agreed immediately with this request. The prisoner was returned to his quarters. When his fellow prisoners heard what had happened, they mocked him. "How can you possibly teach a horse to talk? Absurd." The prisoner replied, "Wait a minute. Think. A year is a long time. In a year, I could die naturally. The Sultan could die. The horse could die. Or, who knows, I might teach the black horse to talk." The lesson of the story, Mr. Zilka said, is if you don't have an immediate answer, buy time. Time, if we use it, might make us adapt and maybe, who knows, find solutions. If speaking to a college or university audience such as this one, Mr. Zilka would conclude, it is the job of the Stanfords of this world to teach the black horse to talk. Thank you.